Good morning to all of our colleagues joining us. My name is Georgina Lawler, and along with my colleague Dr. Brídni Connell, we'd like to welcome you to today's seminar, Developing Anti-Racist Practice in Professional Education. This seminar is part of the National Seminar Series funded by the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning. So before we begin today's proceedings, I'm going to share a short video on the role and the function of the National Teaching and Learning Forum. They've just asked us to do that to promote their work as part of the series. So if you excuse me, I'm just going to move between screens for one moment. So Bríd, you might come in if the audience can't hear this. Now I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll move on to the purpose of today's webinar, which is to place the spotlight on students' experiences of racism on placement and to provide a space for dialogue and discussion for staff in terms of supporting students to address racisms and be anti-racist in their professional practice. So the format for this morning is as follows. Firstly, joining us from Scotland, we're delighted to have Khadija Mohammed deliver a presentation on her experience of developing an anti-racist approach within teacher education. Following Khadija's presentation, we do have some time set aside for Q&A. Then my colleague Brídni Connell, on behalf of the Community Development and Youth Work Programme team of TU Dublin Blanchardstown, will share our experiences and learning on the development of an anti-racist placement training resource for the Community Development and Youth Work Programme. This will then be followed by opportunities for small group discussions in the breakout rooms. So without further delay, I would like to welcome and introduce Khadija Mohammed. Khadija is a programme leader and a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy in the School of Education and Social Sciences in the University of West Scotland. Her PhD centres on racial equality, exploring the lived experiences of Black and minority ethnic teachers in Scotland, with a focus on celebrating their cultural, linguistic and religious identities. Khadija is the co-founder and chair of the SAMEE. This is a community-led organisation providing support to educators and those in support and guidance roles across the Scottish education system, early years schools, colleges and universities. Khadija received the Scottish Trade Union Congress Equality Award in 2019. Khadija is the first BME Muslim educator to be elected as the Vice Convener of the General Teaching Council for Scotland. She was chair of the Advanced HE Scottish Funding Council project tackling racial harassment in universities and colleges, and currently chairs the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project Phase 2 with the QAA. Khadija is also chair of the Scottish Government's Curriculum Reform Group on developing an anti-racist curriculum. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Khadija, and I'm sure we're all really looking forward to hearing about your experiences and insights. So thank you, Khadija.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And you know, you just see it as part of your day-to-day work, don't you, Georgina? But it ends up being a long list of things that we do. But I'll attempt to share my screen, Georgina, so that everybody can see the presentation, I hope. So if you just give me a thumbs up to let me know that you're able to see the screen. Brilliant. Okay, great. So yeah, folks, as Georgina said, I chaired the Tackling Racial Harassment project for Advance HE. It was a great privilege to chair this because the steering group that were involved in this with me were I think the makeup of our group was about 98% of people of colour. And that was fantastic because we were able to bring our lived experiences to those discussions, and that was so important. And what we had decided from the very beginning was that we needed to make sure that we heard wider perspectives as well. So we had a good mix on the steering group. We had students, we had teaching staff, professional services staff, EDI staff. So it was a really good mix. And Dr. Nighat Riaz, my colleague who was working at Advance HE at the time, helped to lead the project from that perspective. But just moving on to set the context for our discussion this morning, the EHRC, so the European Human Rights Commission, published a report, and this was just before the pandemic, and it essentially found that racial harassment was commonplace across our universities and colleges in the UK. And myself and some other colleagues, we weren't surprised. I mean, I've been in teacher education now at university for over 15 years. And by trade, I'm a primary school teacher. And a lot of the times we've heard of colleagues who just simply internalise a lot of that racism as they go through their career journey, and also see our students being exposed to that also. So this was, in one sense, welcome that actually they're documenting this and something needs to be done. And I think it was really that idea that we had to think about it from a strategic perspective. What will our senior leaders do about this? And just to kind of introduce you to some of the statistics here, as you can see, really alarming statistics for us to consider when we think about staff and them experiencing racial harassment. As you can see here, worrying 70% of staff experiencing microaggressions in the workplace, so within a university college setting. For me, also, the worrying aspect was that fewer than 50% of staff did not report it. And again, questions about why are staff not reporting it? Do they not have confidence in the reporting and supporting processes that we may have? Are they not able to trust particular colleagues? What's going on there? What's the underlying things that we need to begin to understand and unpack? And I guess, the 80% of incidents are repetitive and escalating behaviour again, so something not being done and it's just allowed to continue. But for me, colleagues, because obviously as a programme leader, as an academic, and also with my team around me, which is the professional services team, we were really concerned when we saw statistics around students and what they're experiencing, because I often think we're here for our students, aren't we? And we're actually really failing them if these are the statistics that we are getting to see. Very similar to staff, but more though, 66% of our students not reporting racial harassment. And again, bigger questions around why. Is it the sphere of the implications of reporting? Will it have an impact on my results, my grades, my experience all round within the university? For me, another worrying statistic, 25% reported being harassed by a tutor or an academic. And again, there was microaggressions, 42% experiencing microaggressions within the campus space, or 27% reporting racial harassment in a teaching setting. Yeah, so actually in those settings where we should be inviting our students into safe spaces, what are we looking at here? So those statistics were quite, problematic for us as a team, as a steering group moving forward. And we actually had to think, where do we go next with this? How do we begin to address these real issues? And the EHRC report actually did make some recommendations. They came up with some key themes, essentially 3 of them, but the one at the very bottom there, that change in university culture, that was really important for us, where we thought We need to think about how do our senior leaders, and that's from, you know, from our vice chancellors to governing bodies to our court to our programme leaders, you know, and so on and so forth, about how are we setting those expectations, what oversight are we having, and how are we really beginning to scrutinise what is going on within our university spaces. And just a very quick overview of the work that we had, because obviously we'd met first time, and we met for the first time in Edinburgh as a steering group, and then with I think it was in March, we had lockdown, and we had a big decision to make whether we were going to actually continue or were going to put the work on hold. And I think I was absolutely determined that we weren't going to do that. And I got the support from the group, so we continued. And as you can see from there, we faced the pandemic, but we also had this idea that I'm referring to as being bold. Our education minister in Scotland keeps telling me to be bold in the work around anti-racist curriculum, and so I've held on to that. But being bold in terms of trying to speak to our gatekeepers. We had to speak to, you know, university secretaries group, and there was colleagues who were wonderful, opening those doors for us, allowing me to speak to, you know, our senior learning and teaching committee within Scotland's universities and colleges and so on and so forth. And then we actually then hit, you know, the other milestone of the killing of George Floyd. And I absolutely don't wish to use George Floyd, and I don't think we ever should use that as a stimulus for our discussions, but we know what happened with the killing of George Floyd. We had the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, and that really brought to fore a lot of issues, because many universities and colleges in Scotland certainly came to the fore with strapline statements. You know, we are an inclusive, you know, and diverse institution. And actually, a lot of it for me was empty rhetoric, because you think we make these bold statements, but we don't really look at, well, the statistics are telling us clearly that we're not providing inclusive spaces. And it was really to face up to that fact and really begin to think about, let's take stock within our own institutions. And we did that in my own institution. Actually, my principal at the time, Craig, has now moved on, and was really responsive, and we held a Let's Take Stock event at UWS to really think about what's happening in our own front yard, so to speak. We were hoping to launch our project assets for Black History Month, but again, we try to avoid that sort of tokenistic. Oftentimes I'll get an email in my inbox, you know, from senior colleagues saying, Khadija, it's Black History Month, what are we going to do? And I was bold enough to say and reply back saying, I don't know, you tell me. And I thought, be careful, you'll get your P45. But no, it was great, because it stimulates a conversation between colleagues, that it doesn't fall upon your colleagues of colour to take these conversations forward. Yeah, it's everybody's responsibility to do that. I'm more than happy and willing to support, but let's do it collectively. And then obviously we had the soft launch earlier in 2020, which was 2021, which was great. And we received some great support from everybody around that. The task we were given was to produce a suite of resources, a toolkit essentially. And I don't know, being a primary school teacher, I was very averse to toolkits. And I was averse because oftentimes what happens is we are you know, given a topic box and we go away and deliver that, or there's a programme of work that's been created already. But actually, if we don't have the nuanced understanding of what it is we're about to teach, we actually can end up reinforcing negative stereotypes. So we did produce a toolkit, but it was a very considered toolkit, very different pieces of work that you can use to support. And essentially what we were trying to do was raise awareness and that visibility of the harassment, but also trying to help our fellow colleagues to begin to think about developing that really important anti-racist consciousness that was a key part of this project, but it had to be a long-term strategy, colleagues. Otherwise, it just wasn't going to work. And we wanted it to have this notion of a whole school approach. So within our School of Education, a whole university approach. It had to be absolutely a sort of dedicated resource, so the capacity had to be there, but really that all-time accountability and that shared leadership. And the thing I'm going to say about here is this, where I've got at the bottom about consulting with BAME staff. So important. Where you have BAME staff in your institution, please recognise, acknowledge and value the cultural assets that they bring with them. Because oftentimes, I know myself, for many years as a teacher in a school in Scotland, I didn't think about my identity or the multiple repertoires to my identity. I essentially was playing white. I didn't wear a hijab at the time, so I wasn't visibly a Muslim woman. My name would obviously give the game away. But when I was in my own teacher training programme many years ago, I never had conversations about my identity and who I am. I essentially was trying to fit in with the rest of my peer group, who were essentially majority white ethnic backgrounds. So please do capitalise on that, but show value to it, and work collectively to across. We also came up with a declaration. We wanted to make a real public statement, because oftentimes in this work, we were often faced with some challenging comments from colleagues to say, racism doesn't exist. You know, we're in a post-racial era, Khadija, what are you talking about? We're academics, you know, we don't need to deal with this. We're all very well educated, we know what we're doing. And I'm not questioning that at all. But as a steering group, we were determined to say, we're not going to question, does racism exist? We are absolutely categorically stating that racism exists on our campuses and in our society, and we're going to call it what it is and reject it in all its forms, and we're going to stand united against it. And that was really key for us moving forward. And actually, to say out loud, racism is in our everyday. And that's, as a steering group, was coming across quite powerful. So whether there was colleagues who were working as professional services staff in EDI roles, who were BAME, were also saying that oftentimes in their role they were quite vulnerable, because they're talking about race equity work, but because they were BAME themselves, they were being scrutinised and questioned whether they were being overly sensitive around those situations. But actually what we were missing was the valuable lived experiences that they were bringing to those conversations. So that's about that, acknowledging those diverse multiple repertoires to one's identity. But it was a great starter, folks, because we had all 19 of our universities and 26 of our colleges in Scotland all endorsed this declaration. So all our senior leaders, vice chancellors, principals endorsed it. And that was a big step. And our then Minister for Further Education, Richard Lochhead, had really endorsed this too as well, which was fantastic. I think it really gave us that senior leader buy-in to what we were doing, and that was key to the work moving forward. And I think what then happened was there was a real, it was considered a landmark moment in Scotland, actually, and it was super, the support. But then the work really was to begin, because we thought, right, now that we've got all our senior leaders to sign up to this, we need to support them. We need to provide some form of scaffolding for them to begin to think about, how do we as an institution move forward with this? And what we did was we borrowed actually from our lovely colleague down south, Assistant Professor Gurnam Singh. Some of you may have heard of his work, and his work was great in the sense that he produced a toolkit. And we used that, we modified it with his permission. And what we did was, it really was to think about that strategic commitment and leadership, and begin to actually really begin to take stock. And how we did that was, I know in my own institution we did it. We did a sort of staff development day, and it was primarily for my school, which is the School of Education. And we were looking at one aspect of that diagnostic tool. There's a whole host of them, and we focus on an anti-racist curriculum. We had programme leaders there, we had staff, professional services staff, and we said to them, across this trajectory, I'd hidden the headings at the top, and you'll understand why, because one of the headings at the left-hand side was white supremacy, and it moved along to white indifference, and right along to allyship. And when I covered up the headings and we had to look at the questions within the columns, and we said, realistically, honestly, where are we with our curriculum? And we found we were very much towards the left-hand side. And when I revealed the headings at the top, some of my colleagues were like gasps in the audience. Oh my goodness, we've got work to do. And that was great, that acknowledgement. And there was maybe one or two colleagues who were kind of fearful, thinking, oh my goodness, what does this mean for us? But there was many of them looking forward to the challenge, and actually then looking at the columns that were taking us more towards the kind of allyship aspect and the real, anti-racist curriculum statements was great. We can get there. So there was that real enthusiasm for it, and that was really, really important for us to see. But what actually happened was, so that diagnostic tool has these 8 statements running down the left-hand side, and then we have some key statements and questions for colleagues to follow. You'll find that resource on the Advance HE website if you ever want to look at it more closely. I'll not talk about those 8 statements in depth, but just to say to you that before I move on to the work that I've developed in teacher education and beyond that, is this idea of the 8 statements that we did come up with. This was our scaffolding for the sector. And before we did anything, I had to say to colleagues, there's no point in having a toolkit. There's no point in even having these conversations. But before we even begin to think about that nuanced understanding, do we have the language with which to name, frame and address racism? Because if we don't have the language to have those nuanced understandings, we're actually not going to manage to achieve what we've set out here. So it was that fostering an anti-racist culture of understanding, that building racial literacy for everybody that was working with our students, professional services staff, academic staff, our in-school mentors. So, for example, within the School of Education, we've got our community education colleagues, we've got our teacher education colleagues. And so even, my ComEd colleagues were saying, Khadija, our students go out in placement. We need to be thinking about this. Absolutely. And the youth workers who are mentors for them, we need to work with them. All of those questions were coming to the fore. But as you can see, it kind of stemmed from moving on from developing an anti-racist curriculum to begin to think about how we are reporting and supporting. What are our procedures within our own institutions? Do our students feel safe coming to report? Do the colleagues who are doing the documentation of that reporting, do they have an understanding of race and racism and how it manifests? Because sometimes that's where some of the gaslighting can occur. That's where students don't feel confident thinking, will I be questioned? Will I be accused of being overly sensitive, perhaps too vulnerable? Do I have evidence? And we know from statistics that 70% of staff were talking about microaggressions. Microaggressions are those very subtle, covert acts of racism, that slur, that slight look, that comment. And oftentimes we don't have the evidence, but it's felt, yeah? And so how do we deal with that? But for us, the monitoring and the reporting, we can collect data, colleagues, but what are we doing with that data? How do we get into the granular aspects of that data? So sometimes, are we thinking about statistical, quantitative data? Are we capturing that qualitative data where we're getting to hear the counter narratives of our students saying, here's what I have experienced, because that's so powerful when you hear it from that perspective. But ultimately, you can see we also had some students, some universities saying, well, Khadija, we're in a very white setting. We don't have much diversity here at all. Actually, I don't think we have a problem here at all. And I always draw on the work of Chris Gain. He did a lot in schools, and he talked about the persisting myth about white schools. Actually, it's those very institutions that need to have those conversations. Because actually when we're talking about preparing our students for a world of work that's very diverse, then we're actually doing them an injustice. So reach out to grassroots BAME-led organisations who can work with you in the university if you don't have that diversity within house. But ultimately for us, there was something missing. We originally had 7 statements and I said, something's not right. Something's missing here. And because we kept coming back to the so what. And the so what was the responsibility and accountability. We absolutely need to have that in place. We needed to have our senior leaders to continue and sustain that conversation, because I'm already concerned that what happens is other things start to take precedence, and sometimes in some pockets you begin to see that interest in all this anti-racist practice beginning to wane. It's because something else has come on and we have to then focus on that. But it's that sustaining those conversations which will be really key. So, okay, that's really the project, and that really helped me to move on to begin to think about some of the work that I'm doing with my student teachers. And I'm going to use the word teacher, because actually there is no real, I've never found an absolute definition of teacher that I'm really happy with, because I quite like the word educator, because I work with my community education colleagues and their students as well. They're educators. My early years practitioner students are educators. So I tend to kind of go between the phrase, but because I'm steeped in teacher education, and this was the work that I'm doing, so you'll see the word teacher coming to the fore here. So just bear with me. But if you think about the issues being parallel in ComEd, please think of it that way. But I love this quote, colleagues, and I can't talk highly enough about it, because for me, it's so key. When I do not know myself, I cannot know who my students are, and when I can't see them clearly, I cannot teach them well. And from this, I began to think about, what does that mean about knowing myself? And it was so interesting, because for me, it really was a journey. And my journey started when I was still teaching in a school, and 9/11 had happened, and I had it was primary 7, so in Scotland that's your final stage of primary before you move into high school. So children who were aged between 10 and 11. And I came in to school the following days after, and the children said, "Mrs. Mohammed, did you see what the Muslims did?" And it was a really interesting conversation. And I said, "No, tell me. And once we had the conversation, I said, "Boys and girls, what faith do you think I follow?" And it was only because I wasn't wearing my hijab. And I said, "My name might give you a clue." And there was this pin drop silence in the room. And wee boy Jamie at the back shouts, "You're a Muslim." I said, "Yes, I am." And he says, "But you're different. You're not like them. You're like us." And such a fascinating conversation followed. What does that mean? What does "I'm not like them" mean? And that I'm more like you. And we unpacked that, but it helped me as a teacher thinking about my identity, that I am a woman, I am a woman of colour, I am a Muslim woman of colour. Yet now I wear a hijab, so that visibility is more at the front. So actually, Kimberly Crenshaw talks about that intersectionality, and talks about the multiple forms of disadvantage that we face in terms of discrimination and so on. But it really helped me to think about who I am as an individual, how that impacts on my pedagogy, how that helps me to see the learners in front of me and begin to tailor my pedagogical approaches to suit. So it was a real turning point in my career for me. And when I came into working in teacher education, the majority of my students are all from a white ethnic background. And so for me, it was really important for them to begin to think about their racial identity development. But I didn't go in there straight away. I was still learning myself, so my confidence kind of moved on over the years as a teacher educator. And I keep drawing on this aspect of being, becoming and growing as a teacher, or being, becoming and growing as an educator, whether it's in ComEd, in youth work and so on and so forth. My early years practitioner students on my early years programmes, I talk to them about this as well. But it's really important to begin to think about how we teach and what we teach. And the approaches, we know we've heard of, an inclusive curriculum, and oftentimes we think about, the different authors that we might have on our reading list. We talk about the decolonised curriculum, where we talk about unpacking some of that colonial history. But actually for us, it was a decision to make about calling it an anti-racist curriculum, because I wanted that anti-racist lens, that consciousness to permeate throughout all of those discussions, that, whose voices are being heard over others, what perspectives are we missing, are we reinforcing negative stereotypes without realising it, how are we co-constructing with our students, and in particularly with our diverse students? Do they see themselves being reflected in the curriculum that we are using with them? So really important questions for me to think about. So for me then, racially literate educators. So for the students that I am working with in teacher education and with my students in ComEd at UWS, I'm thinking of them as, how do I help to develop their racial literacy? And again, I feel really strongly about this, that where we have educators who can deconstruct their own whiteness, they're far better positioned to see why our current aspects of curriculum might not be fit for purpose. And it's been really interesting because I've asked some of my students, and one of my students said, I asked them about their ethnic identity, and she said, oh, but I don't have an ethnicity, Khadija. I'm white. And I found that really interesting. And it just showed you the lack of understanding around these discussions. And actually, it was important for me to create safer and braver spaces for my students to have these conversations. So I know we hear a lot of calling out and so on. I like the idea of calling in. And it was this idea of saying to my students, I'm inviting you to a safe space, and we're going to have some really critical conversations, and they might be uncomfortable, but I want you to lean into that discomfort, because I think that in that space of discomfort, there's some real learning to take place that will challenge you. And they really embrace it, and it really has been fantastic. There have been some comments that I've received, which I wanted to share with you, with some of my students. One said, I found this quite confusing at times, Khadija. If I'm not a racist, surely it means that I will be fine when I teach those who are not white. And one said, I worry about saying the wrong thing and insulting someone without intending to. This has made me really think about what it is to be white. And today I notice the colour of my skin. And another one said, I'm so glad that I was part of these conversations. I still need to get my head around this, but we'll find out more and talk to my friends. I will also note what I see happening in schools when I am on placement. And that was really, it was just heartening. But you could also see the other hand of somebody saying, well, I'm not a racist, so surely I can't offend. And I got into this a conversation with saying, well, actually, I'm sure you'll agree, it's now not good enough just to say, I'm not a racist. Actually, it's about saying, I'm an anti-racist educator. And what does that mean? Because we know that oftentimes the word anti-racism is seen quite negatively. I've worked with head teachers who said, oh, I don't like that. I'd rather call it multiculturalism. And I'm saying, well, that's one of the reasons why we're still here. I blame the multiculturalism model. It's that celebratory, tokenistic approach. And anti-racism is rooted in action. Yeah, we've got to remember that. It's absolutely rooted in action. And so my students saying to me, we're committing to that, was fantastic. But essentially, it's the so what. So if you are working, so for in-school supporters, it was really important for me to begin to talk about this. So we did a session for our placement providers. So all our students who were going to community education placements, to our early years nursery settings, to our teacher settings, school settings, we did a session with them. And it was nice actually to bring them all together and begin to talk about their different experiences and about how they are race cognizant. How can we help to develop their racial literacy so that they're able to support our BAME students when they're on placement? Because a lot of our BAME students, when I say a lot, we don't have very many. I sometimes can count on one hand how many we have. And for me, that's a lot. And actually, we send them out to placements. And oftentimes they'll come back and say, Khadija, and some of them are not my students, but they'll contact me. And that's interesting. And they probably contact me because I look like them. And they'll say to me, Khadija, I don't know what it is. And I don't want to jump to any, conclusions here. And I don't want to think that am I being paranoid or am I being oversensitive? But I'm not receiving the same level of support than Sarah in the other room. And we're both students, we talk to each other and she tells me the support she's getting, but I don't seem to be getting that. Or I've had a student say to me, Khadija, it was all well, the placement was doing fine. As soon as I asked my placement mentor, I'd like to pray, because one of my prayer times falls during my placement hours and it's at lunchtime though, so I won't have to leave the setting. But could I have a quiet space just to throw down my prayer mat and say my prayers? And she says, that day on, my mentor changed. And I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I think it was because I was visibly, actively trying to show that I'm a Muslim and I'm praying, and something changed and I don't know what it was. Or I can't do anything right. Everything I say is wrong, or I'm being questioned all the time, I'm being scrutinised all the time. And one time I actually spoke to a student in their first language because I thought that would help us to connect and build a rapport. And I was criticised immediately. You can't speak in your first language. The other students can't understand that. And actually missing the point that that's such a valuable thing to do, because even monolingual students love it and they can learn from it. And what we're doing is we're giving out a message that all languages are welcome. So if you look at these slides here, these were just some comments that I've started to populate. I'm developing a national anti-racist framework for initial teacher education. And one of them is about recruitment. So thinking about how do we partner with our schools and hold summer programmes. So whether it's for teaching, whether it's for community education, because even in our community education programme at UWS, again, I think I can count on one hand the number of BAME students that we have. So we need to diversify all our community settings, whether they are school settings, nursery settings, community youth work settings. How do we work closely with those communities at the grassroots level? And how are we marketing it as a university? How are we creating that sense of belonging that a BAME student goes, oh gosh, no, I don't think I fit there, so I'm not going to bother applying. Interviews, often the questions that we ask at interviews or who's on the interview panel has been a real issue for me as well, and the kinds of questions that we're asking our students. So something for us to think about, and I've already changed some of our own questions and happy to share them at some point. But for me, this one around practices that may serve as barriers to the presence and well-being of our student teachers of colour or our students of colour within our institutions. And I did a session on Let's Talk About Race with my postgrad secondary students. There were 3 students of colour in the audience. And afterwards they came out and said, thank you so much, Khadija. In the 6 months that we've been here, I feel like someone has seen me. I suddenly have become visible. And for me, that was quite profound. And ensuring staff and school mentors and youth, workmen's ComEd placement mentors are equipped and developed to support student teachers of colour. And how do we begin to do that, working closely with them and monitoring our learning environments are so key for our students. And just moving on finally before I end, this particular one again was talking about, 1 second folks, other technology issue that I have forgotten to do is switch on my power. I just got a message to say your battery's about to go. That would have been the disaster. So building racial literacy, so key, colleagues, and I can't stress that enough, because I've been in so many forums with my own fellow colleagues who will challenge me, and I don't, it doesn't bother me so much. What it does tell me is my colleagues need some support. And, sometimes I get frustrated, and if I'm being very honest, but, I think maybe being a teacher by trade, you have that nurturing, caring aspect. And for me, it's about supporting my colleagues. If they need support in these areas, I will do that. And so just things for us to think about here. And I'm happy to share those slides later on, but placement support is key. Working closely with our providers, ensuring that our placement handbooks very clearly outline not just the process to follow should a student raise a concern, but also how can we signpost them to further support. So support in terms of racial trauma and well-being, that's so key for us. Because many of our students might not know how to deal with that, and they're internalising it all the time. So do our handbooks give them that information? Do we actually specifically mention in our handbooks, if you experience a racist incident, here's how you can reach for support. Here's how you will begin to report this. And I know that in our handbooks, we didn't have it. We didn't have that clause. And I remember working with another colleague, and we managed to find a set of words that we've now inserted into our placement handbooks. And that's been helpful for teacher education handbooks, for our early years, for our ComEd colleagues, and also our social work. So it was great. So something for us to think about there. But just moving on, because I'm very conscious of my time, I've probably gone way over, Brits, so apologies. But this idea of pedagogy of justice, I just think that, you know, it is hard for, it's all our students' responsibility and also all our responsibility as educators, that it's not easy. And Nado Aveling always talks about this as a white academic, because as soon as we begin to interrogate our own racialised, gendered, class-based positioning, it feels like we're hacking at our very roots. And so it's that leaning into that discomfort, walking the talk, moving beyond that space of resentment or guilt, because sometimes people get resentful about this or defensive, but to moving towards becoming, you know, really effective white allies. And that's really key for us moving forward. And so this idea of, you know, potential pushback is important for us to begin to think about, because we'll often find that. So safe spaces are key in the work that we do. I've been reading a lot of work on Rita Coley, and she says our article is called "Teachers, Please Learn Our Names." And I often say that to my colleagues, getting your students' names correct is just a fundamental matter of respect. Yeah, just ask. And I often say to my student teachers, don't worry, don't anglicise, just ask again and say, please correct me if I pronounce this incorrectly, because it's someone's identity. But the pushback we get, I'm just going to very quickly show you some of the comments. You can read them for yourselves. I've often felt a lot of pushback when I do this work. You know, why is this? This is not core business priority. You know, this is political correctness gone mad, so on and so forth. And I don't need to worry about this. We're not a very diverse setting at all. So we need to be prepared to have responses for those pushbacks that we get. But essentially, it comes down to these 4 areas for me: positionality, identity, you know, this privilege, this power. How do we begin to work our way around that? And essentially, the take-home message is that acknowledgement, the action that we're going to take, and ultimately the accountability that we all should take on board when working towards that anti-racist consciousness within whichever professional field that we're in. And these were just questions that I thought might, you know, spark off a discussion later, but it really was about saying, what do we do as in school or, you know, community ed placement providers have to think about, or programme leaders and so on, in terms of that visibility of racial harassment? How do we begin to think about that and monitor it throughout? But I'll stop there because I know I've gone way over time, so apologies, and move on. I'll stop presenting.
Thank you so much, Khadija, for that wonderful and insightful presentation. I know, personally speaking, I am developing the fieldwork handbook for community development and youth work at the moment. And you're right, we don't have anything in our handbook on sign, but we have it somewhere else. So I think we need to integrate it in. So that would be my key takeaway from today. And again, I know some of the comments coming in on the chat, people are agreeing with me. It was wonderful and insightful. So we have a few minutes. If I'd like to open the floor up to questions, so if anyone has any questions. Stephanie, you want to come in?
Yeah, please. If that was great, Khadija. And the handbook struck me. I mean, I write the handbook for her, and I thought absolutely, you know, that should be included. So that was really good. I suppose the term people of color, women of color, it just really sits uneasy with me, and I try to explain this to students that, you know, and I've always said it, look, we're all, white is a color as well, you know, and I'm just wondering if that term, if it tends to other people who are not white, or is there a term that we can use that is more inclusive and it doesn't set people apart, even though we have to acknowledge that the experiences of a black woman or a black man or a white woman or white man are very, very different. But that's my unease with that. So I'm just wondering what you think.
Yeah, Stephanie, you're not the only one who's raised that. So, and thank you for raising it. even in our work within Scottish Government now, we have had some grassroots organisations. There's a particular charity called Intercultural Youth Scotland, a fabulous charity set up recently, and they have started, so even in our Scottish Government work, we have started to use terminology like, so they use BIPOC, Black and People of Colour. And there's lots of research justifying that particular terminology. And it's grown from the United States, obviously. Here in the UK, in England, predominantly it was BAME. In Scotland, I know we used a lot of BME. So I use those terms deliberately, Stephanie, interchangeably, because the terminology is problematic. It always will be problematic, because also it would suggest when we have those labels that we're a homogenous group within those labels, and we're not. We're very diverse even within that. And so what we've been doing is trying in Scotland to try and use those terms to actually then encourage that dialogue as well. But there will be academics, Stephanie, who will absolutely argue that the experiences of a person of colour, or as a person who has, just simply because of the colour of their skin being black, brown, is very different from somebody who has white skin. And there are many, I mean, Professor David Gilburn actually in England talks a lot around that work, and is probably much more articulate in explaining that in his work. But there's been real debates around that, Stephanie, and I hear that, and many times I'll have comments from colleagues myself to say, I don't like the use of that term, Khadija. And we open it up to debate, and then I'll share some articles around some of the comments around why it's absolutely perfectly fine to use it, why perhaps it's not the same experiences. So there's a whole host of things within there, Stephanie, but I use it deliberately to try and say that this is the terminology that's out there at the moment when we have these conversations.
That's really helpful, Khadija. Yeah. That's really helpful, actually, you know, to not just to use a variety of terms and then open the conversation. So, so thank you. Thanks, Georgina, as well.
Yeah, it's almost like, Stephanie, you know, when we had Black Lives Matter resurge movement, and then in Twitter became quite toxic because people were saying all lives matter. And actually there was a real kind of misunderstanding there, and it wasn't because of course all lives matter, but the fact that some people's lives don't matter simply because of the colour of their skin. That was a key issue. So there's lots of debate around that. Yeah.
Brilliant. I think Liz wants to come in with a question.
Yes, thanks. Hi, Khadija. Thanks a million for that presentation. And I'm from the Royal College of Surgeons, and I'm quite new to the role. So sessions like this are so powerful in building my knowledge and awareness. I just wanted to, you know, come in about the terminology, and that it's constantly evolving and constantly changing. And I love the point, because, you know, a couple of months ago we were told that, you know, BAME is not a terminology that we should use, but I think you've explained it very well in that it really encourages debate and discussion, and it's just like, you know, and it is asking questions. And have you any advice for I think one of the challenges that we all have is the fear factor, that a lot of my colleagues are so afraid of saying the wrong thing that they don't say anything at all. So have you any kind of further advice? And I loved your point around, I am an anti-racist educator, and just actually calling it out and making people feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. And you again, a really important question here, that you're right, because silence breeds complicity, doesn't it? When we remain silent on these issues, we actually become complicit. And it's about then, how do we take that stance, but also being fearful. I mean, I know many colleagues will say, Khadija, I'm so afraid because I don't want to offend and I don't want to say the wrong thing. And I think sometimes actually acknowledging that is really the first part of it, is to say, I need some support. I don't know it all. I'm beginning to develop my own racial literacy here, my own language around this. And so if I do say something incorrect, you know, please do say, and we can have so it's that calling in aspect again there. But for me, Liz, it really is about how are we, so if you're in a leadership position, Liz, your responsibility would be, how do I have oversight of this? how will I create those safer, braver spaces for my colleagues so that they are able to have these conversations? And so do we provide some sort of anti-racist training for them that helps to develop their language around it? And we've got a race glossary on the Advance HE website that has terms like, you know, even race and racism, because race is a contested term if we think about one human race biologically. And we also have terms like white fragility, white privilege, microaggressions. What do they mean? What do they mean to you? And some people get quite defensive over them and so on and so forth, but they're great roots in, and actually recommending some good literature for folk to read as well around the whole colonial history and so on, because actually once we have our own understanding of it from a personal perspective, we then can begin to think about how that impacts on our professional practice. How are we working with patients who are from BAME backgrounds? You know, are we reinforcing negative stereotypes around that particular community of people? So it really is about how you help to develop their racial literacy so that they develop that confidence. And talking to BAME colleagues, there are many BAME colleagues in medicine and so on and so forth. How do we capitalise and show value to the cultural, linguistic, religious expertise that they will bring to their practice? Or they might be like me, Liz, for many years, where I kept that hidden. I kept that internalized. I didn't think that my culture, my language had any part to play in my teaching. I was there to teach a bunch of children, and I actually realized that, no, my identity, so that racial identity development is so key. And I say to my students, white racial identity development, how did I come to be who I am? That's so important, because once I know how I came to be, I can begin to think about how others did as well, and begin to appreciate those differences and celebrate and acknowledge those differences and the commonality too. So that was a long-winded answer, Liz.
No, that's great. And we have produced a race equality action plan, because we are, you know, the point that you made about, you know, we've such an international student, staff and student profile. So it's going well, and lots of stuff happening in the curriculum as well, which is very, very exciting. But no, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And thanks. We will have, after the breakout room session, some more time for Q&A. So just to keep us on track, I'm going to move on now to our second presentation of the morning. My colleague Bríd Connell will deliver a presentation on the work we've been doing here in the Community Development and Youth Work Programme in TU Dublin on developing an anti-racist placement training resource. Bríd is Senior Lecturer in the School of Humanities, excuse me, with research experience in the areas of racism, migration and integration. Bríd is the team lead on this work. So Bríd, I will hand over to you.
Thanks a million, Georgina. Good morning to everybody, and a huge thanks to Khadija. I could listen to you all day, and I have so many takeaways. I don't even think I could, you know, I need to go back and look at all of them again. So thanks a million for that. And I suppose I'm here on behalf of the Community Development and Youth Work team. Georgina is part of the team. I see Liam McGlynn, my colleague, on the call, Gareth Smith, and also Mairead Clusky, who worked with us last year when we were very unfortunate or very sad when she left us for other pastures. But we've also worked in conjunction with Noreen McNamara from the EDI Directorate. So really it's on behalf of all the team that I am just giving some insight into our developing anti-racist practice in the Community Development and Youth Work programme. I suppose just a little bit of background. I'm sorry, my slides don't appear to be moving. Yeah, okay. So I suppose what started out as was I had a student who did a master's on interculturalism in the youth services in Dublin 15, and she identified that our students were witnessing racism on placement and they didn't feel equipped to deal with it. And I suppose that was our starting point. Then obviously, as you know, I suppose what Khadija alluded to as well in terms of the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, I think it did in Ireland particularly place the focus on the fact that racism isn't just a global phenomenon, but it is also a pervasive feature of Irish society. And that is really our starting point. And I think what we saw in Ireland at the time, because we have far less data than either the UK or the US available, but young people, particularly on social media, shared their experiences as well. And I suppose, and we are, as a white settled group of lecturers on the programme, we teach diverse students. And so we felt that we needed to, it was an issue that we needed to take action on. So we're located in Dublin 15, which would be in the county of Fingal, which in Ireland would have the second highest number of migrants, and obviously then those of migrant background as well. We applied for funding from the Impact project. This would have been funded by the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning. And the overall aim of our work was to embed anti-racism in our community development and youth work programme. So we were looking to introduce changes on the programme, to develop the racial literacy of staff and then their reflective practice around this, but also to support students to identify racism and then empower them to respond to it. And this is the work. So I'm just going to very briefly introduce the work that we did last year, the 12-month Lekela process. This was a whole programme approach. So it was around encouraging best practice to enhance the student experience, but also to support the continuous professional development of staff in the area as well. And so I'm just going to talk about the work we did there. And then building on, we got an additional piece of funding from our EDI Directorate to develop this anti-racism placement resource. And this is then the work in progress that I'll talk a little bit about afterwards. I suppose just anti-racism, first and foremost, it is very much in keeping with the values of community development and youth work. We are a dual endorsed programme by the All-Ireland Endorsement Body for Community Work, Education and Training, but also NSETS, or North-South Education and Training Standards Committee for Youth Work. And anti-racism, it's very much in keeping with the values, core values, particularly anti-discrimination, equality and human rights. And this will be one of the core values underpinning community development and youth work practice and education. And anti-racism as a call for action. I mean, that's very much in keeping with our vision of our programme to produce graduates who are agents of change. So we felt, echoing Angela Davis, it wasn't enough to be non-racist, that we must be anti-racist. It needed to be explicit and it needed to be intentional. And as I said, across the programme, this wasn't just discipline specific. Just in terms of our approach, we worked, and this would be in keeping with community development and youth work, we worked in partnership with our students, so co-creating knowledge and co-creating outputs, and the staff. And I speak about the, as a woman, as a white woman, settled Irish woman, we were very much on a learning process around this with our students. And our student voice has been and continues to be key to our work, and particularly our diverse students. Who would roughly be, and we don't have the same statistics available officially, even though I know there is work being done on this. I mean, in the Irish context, we only even have our first survey on race equality among staff last year. So there is a gap at the moment, but roughly we would have between 25% and kind of roughly a quarter and a third of our students would come from minority ethnic backgrounds across our programme. And the framework we used was, I suppose, drawn from Lana Gunnia's racial literacy framework. The idea that obviously if race is, a social, we see it as a social construction, but it's also a structure of power. And as this structure of power, it intersects with other systems of oppression, the likes of race, class, gender, etc. So there is that intersectionality. So while race might be at the focus of it, we are looking very much at this intersectional approach and those other forms of discrimination and disadvantage. I suppose another element would be the idea of race is not just an individual issue, but very much considering the structural element of it. So looking at, racism as this multifaceted phenomenon as the key component of developing racial literacy. And then finally, to echo what Khadija mentioned there, I suppose this idea that, within our classrooms, I suppose developing racial literacy involves learning and unlearning. And our classrooms, within higher education, provide a space for this. I suppose looking that our classrooms aren't necessarily safe spaces for all of our students, given the power and privilege differentials that exist there. So not just between the lecturer and the students, but also within our student cohort as well. And so recognising that these discussions around race, racism and racial inequality, that they are essential to developing racial literacy, but also the discomfort and the uncomfortable nature of these. And I think we need to recognise that, but that our classrooms, but also creating space, we created space in our classrooms, but also creating space in our programme as well. So just in terms of a little flavour of the student voices that would have informed the project, I mean, we used it was action research we carried out. We used a mixed methods approach. We ran focus groups with our students. We also got surveys from students, and we also then our students their reflections that they produced in various modules. These were all then analysed thematically afterwards. I teach a module in 4th year on combating racism. So as part of an introductory reflection, where students would start just talking about their understanding of some of these concepts, students were asked around, if racism presented as an issue on placement, and then with students' consent, these were all analysed afterwards. And almost 3/4 of our students said that they did present as an issue in their community work or youth work settings where they were placed. Now, the vast majority of those would have come into contact with it as white students who were witnessing this, primarily amongst young people using racist terms, racist language, and it was also between different minority ethnic groups. So, for example, it could have been between travellers and people of African descent. We had one student who spoke about personal experience, and in a way, some of this was new to staff, that we these issues, if you like, hadn't been documented before, or we weren't necessarily asking the questions. So this student here spoke about her experience, saying, and it would have been 2 years previously, in her 2nd year placement, she had an incident, someone attacking her verbally about a visible marker of difference. She didn't know how to react, and she didn't know what to do, what were her options, if she'd have to call college. So she didn't do any of it. And this was part of a focus group where the previous student had spoken about, maybe that what Khadija said, that signposting students to supports, and students know what to do if they experience it themselves. Another area that came up was, and the second quote is from a white Irish student, but a number of students mentioned this when it was an actual staff member was the perpetrator, and the additional challenge that places on students, that they don't know how to respond to it, particularly as the student said, as a student, you don't want to be removed from the service. So there is that challenge of dealing with power differentials. And then finally, as part of our work, we would have been feeding into the race equity strategy that was being developed by TU Dublin at the time, and our students fed into this. So this is a 3rd year student from a minority ethnic background who spoke about her campus experience, saying, you don't feel safe enough to report it, and it's not being discussed, it's not being talked about on campus. And we would have fed these back up, I suppose, at an organisational level, these seldom heard voices to inform the work that was going on. So just there we have a graphic of the programme work last year, or the project work last year. So we started with staff. We ran an anti-racism workshop for staff. We mapped our modules across the programme where racism was just in terms of content, in terms of discussion or assessment. And then we had a reflective practice session for staff. So I suppose reflective practice, it's a complex process, but it does look at a commitment to making changes based on new understandings of how to practice. And this change really starts with the self as the, as an educator, critically analysing our behaviour, our thinking, etc. So at the end of that session, staff basically agreed or, came up with a new action, some intentional action with students, a change they were going to make about anti-racism in their teaching. And this is work that has continued. And I can see colleagues on the call, Ruth Bojena and Jody, who shared 2 weeks ago. We had staff who shared their experiences last semester of embedding anti-racism in their module. So we're looking collaboratively, we're documenting this, but we're also trying to build it into the modules and supporting colleagues, or, if they don't necessarily feel comfortable, or giving people ideas on how, or working across modules in terms of how this could be done. From a student point of view, we had anti-racism workshops before for pre-placement students, year 2 and year 3. Our students go out on placement in the second semester of both those years. Our students also, we facilitated, our students developed an anti-racism charter that I'll share in a moment. But we also had webinars, some of them student-led, like our AFRI Hedge School conference. It's a human rights conference run by students, and racism was one of the themes. We had a Langara exchange, an intercultural exchange with Canada that Georgina led on. And we also finally, I suppose, had, in terms of informing policy, we facilitated a session and produced a response to the government white paper on ending direct provision, which would be our international protection system here in Ireland. But we also then fed into the, as I said, the TU Dublin race equity strategy that was being developed as well at the time. So lots of examples of the work there from last year. And this is just to share with you, this is our third year students as part of their, apologies, my computer seems to have a life of its own, as part of their, we ran a session, myself and Liam, we facilitated. This came from the students that they wanted to come up with a charter, an anti-racism charter. And then we followed on with twice afterwards, we ran sessions with the students to refine it. We sent it to the year 2 students, it was shared with them and they got feedback, and the students themselves finally produced this. So it's their message that they work from an anti-racist perspective, and it sets out those overarching practice principles informing their anti-racist approach. And the students signed up to this before they went out on placement. And I suppose as part of it there, just in terms of number 4, you know, they talk about the anti-racism charter will be promoted on the campus during open days, CEO information days. And I was at an open evening in November with one of our minority ethnic students, and we had pop-up produced that the students wanted this to be on display, this message to show their commitment to it. And she was just so proud of this work that encapsulated, I suppose, what they felt they stood for in terms of the professional values on the programme. So then just moving on very briefly to, I suppose, what we've been building on, and I suppose that is, you know, the foundational piece of work. And in a way, we're just kind of scratching at the surface to some extent, because it's all work in progress on the staff and on the student side. But we started then in September looking at, because this was particularly, the gap was identified, so looking at placement and the aim of what we have developed in terms of a resource. We have a draft resource at the moment, but the overall aim of it is to better prepare students to recognise and address racism in practice placement settings. Now, I would say it is a standalone resource for students, but it is also for staff in terms of developing staff's, you know, racial literacy, adding to that as well. So the first section, and this reflects very much what Khadija was speaking about earlier, this came through both staff and students, these whole kind of, I suppose, a confusion around terminology, around language. And some of this is linked to kind of, I suppose, understanding around these concepts as well. So we try and deal with that in the first section around, race, ethnicity, racialization, racisms, whiteness, white privilege, intersectionality, discrimination, anti-racism, for example. There's a section on the impact of racism. So, you know, there is a bit of, I suppose, explanation, and then there's a link to lots of resources, examples of these lived experiences. And then we decided to look in depth at a number of forms of racism in Ireland. At the moment, as I said, this is draft. We just have 2 there, which is anti-traveller racism and anti-Black racism. But obviously there are more in terms of anti-Muslim racism. The idea is to add to these, but that students see a bit more in depth, I suppose, in understanding historically, but also how the norms kind of develop around these and the particular experiences that you know, these are homogenous groups, but some of the experiences and, you know, differences in outcomes, etc. And then there is a section on policy and legislation, which obviously will be updated as we expect, you know, things like the new hate crime legislation to come in, etc., in the Irish context. The second section then is much more, I suppose, kind of focused on interaction and activities around developing students' capacity to challenge racism. And we start very much from that positionality piece of, you know, personal reflection on the self developing as a practitioner, you know, looking at areas, let's say, like, you know, prejudice and bias, but also then as a practitioner, I suppose, developing with the students what Beverly Tatum talks about, you know, looking at our sphere of influence, or the power to actually bring about change in terms of action. And then I suppose we've looked at initially around microaggressions, that there's role playing and activities around that. But we also then, are getting students to think of, to look, I suppose, discuss the barriers to challenging racism. And we do focus initially on it at an individual level, because I suppose this is one where, what's flagged by our students in terms of their placement experience, what they come into contact with. And it is around, then there's case studies or there's scenarios where students would develop and apply responses to challenging racism in a community development or a youth work setting at an individual level. And then we would move on to the structural or institutional level and have scenarios or case studies around this. And then the final section does, and it is linking into, I suppose, that whole idea of the report and support, but also being informed by the student voice. It is for, I've said, it is for staff and students to, I suppose, try and give this route of, or this clear roadmap of if students experience or witness racism on placement, what is the support and reporting routes that are there. And with that, we worked actually just on the report and the support. We worked with the Immigrant Council of Ireland, their protocol on supporting victims of racism and discrimination. And actually, I should say we brought our partner organisations in January. Valeria Aquino ran a session from the Immigrant Council around supporting victims of racism and discrimination. And then we talked, I suppose, we shared with our placement organisations, our resource, and in terms of this is the reporting, this is what we were, presenting to students, and this is what we are presenting, because it is a resource for staff as well, and that staff were involved in that training as well, and that this was clear to them. And I suppose in a way that our approach that we're looking at is that it's not a punitive approach, but it is a transformative approach. And that we've started that journey we started that conversation with our partner organisations. And in a way, I think we have to acknowledge that a lot of these organisations have an awful lot more experience in terms of anti-racism than we have. So, for example, we'd have traveller organisations. One of our traveller organisations was taking a Black student for the first time and spoke a little bit about the preparation work. And we are looking to link back in and to host something in May, I suppose, to kind of be able to kind of share practice and these learning experiences around this. So that was very much just the start of that conversation. But just to say, the resource itself, while it's a standalone, as I said, for staff and students, but we did then, and we're piloting at the moment, that a series of workshops, pre-placement workshops in year 2 and year 3. So we ran those in January. And very much, I suppose, that idea of scaffolding the learning between where students are at in terms of year 2 and year 3, that this is kind of incrementally being built on. But also, and I think we're very conscious of this, and particularly some of the feedback that came back from both from staff and students around those, pilot workshops where there was, in a way we ran out of time. There was an awful lot of content, but this is part and parcel of, the broader embedding it across the programme. And what we are doing is looking, I know we talked recently even about our first year lectures, going back and actually looking, what pieces from that resource, what is actually looking how explicitly that is being dealt with in particular modules. So we're building on this racial literacy throughout, because there is no quick fix. It's not just about doing, a one-staff workshop and that's it, job done. It is much broader and getting this across the programme as well. It's a collaborative approach. We can't do this on our own. We do need student input on it, as well as staff input. And as I said, we've been engaging now with our partner organisations, but also with the likes of the Immigrant Council of Ireland. We've engaged as well with the Irish Network Against Racism. They would have been involved in giving us training, and also in terms of feedback into the resource. So it's very much, as I said, a work in progress. And I'm just going to finish off with some, just I suppose, some of the learning to date, because obviously we don't have all the data at all. This is ongoing. I mean, while the students say, and this is quotes from the students, it's really important work in terms of anti-racism. I suppose a bit like what Khadija said as well, but they want to make, we want to make sure, and they want to make sure that it's not just box ticking or it's not tokenistic. They also say it shouldn't be just community development and youth work or even humanities. It is something that should be across all programmes. I think that whole idea of the space, the time that it takes, and even what I said around the workshops, that that's part of the approach, that it needs to start right from the start, in terms of the language, in terms of the concepts, and that we build on this throughout the programme. And I think we do need to acknowledge as well, and this links in with the literature, for example, around teacher education, but also in terms of my colleague Ruth Harris's work on transformative learning. I think we need to be realistic about where our first year students are at, and that these are difficult concepts, and in terms of understanding kind of the systemic nature of it, the challenge of structural racism, that these need to be developed incrementally over time, and that we need time for this discussion, and it's not just once off. And I suppose it is that idea that's been well documented of how long transformative learning takes. I suppose this is a huge one, recognizing the power differential. As I said, we are white settled staff. We do not have the lived experiences that our students have within the classroom, or who are sitting, some of our students who are sitting in our classroom. But I suppose then it's also taking those student lived experiences and trying to, create educational opportunities to build that critical awareness and critical analysis, which is needed to be able to understand and challenge these issues at a structural level. And I suppose the last point, and in a way from what Khadija has said earlier, it's the staff, and I suppose reaching out even more to our minority ethnic staff across the campus. But in a way, I think absolutely at the moment, we need to respond to those needs of our students, of our racially minoritized students. Even the students spoke that report and support, last week, one of our Black students talked about, but what are the supports that are in place in terms of a white counsellor? How comfortable do I feel or not feel going to that, going to that person? So I think all of this is a conversation that we're looking to bring forward as well, to advocate change at an organisational level, and to hear those counter narratives that are really important to inform the work, but also at an organisational level, that we can have, the appropriate supports that are in place as well. So, Georgina, I'm going to hand it over to you in terms of the breakout rooms and the questions.
That's great, Bríd. Thanks for your presentation and for sharing what we're doing. As you said, very much a work in progress. But now we'd like to give everybody here the opportunity to discuss your own kind of experiences in developing anti-racist practice in professional education. And what we're going to do is break you into 4 breakout rooms, and we'd like you to consider some of the questions. So what are your experiences of developing anti-racist practice in professional education in your professional setting? What challenges have you encountered? What's worked well, in good practice examples? And then the key thing, and this is what we're going to ask for specific feedback on, if you were to select one action to drive forward anti-racist practice in higher education, what would it be? I am going to put into the chat now a link to a Padlet. So you can use the Padlet. Has that link gone through? Yeah. You can use the Padlet to collect and to collate your feedback. So if one member of the breakout room would take on that role of note taker, and you can just populate the Padlet in real time. So we'll have about 20 minutes in the breakout rooms, and then we'll convene back in the main room. So Bríd is going to whiz us off, and I'm happy to type in 1 or 2 notes. If we just want to go around the rooms really quickly and really get the feedback on one key action we can take in higher education to drive forward developing anti-racist practice in professional education. So does someone from Group 1 want to give their feedback? Do you know who's in the different groups?
Yeah, sorry, Group 1 was Jodie, Grania, Khadija, Faith and Kathleen.
I think Grania got locked out. She wasn't able to get it in, and she had to leave, and I think she was trying to get back in, so we didn't hear her.
Does anyone from Group 1 just want to give us the one key action we can develop, that we can take in higher education to develop anti-racist practice in professional education? What was your key action?
Geraldine, I think we spoke a lot about things that folk have been doing, but probably I think just to sum up would be that developing their own sort of personal understanding around, you know, issues, so that they better understand what's there and how they can then begin to use that to inform their practice. I think that's kind of, I don't know, Kathleen, Jodie, anybody want to come in? Do you think that's a fair action that we took from our conversation?
Yeah, I think that sounds good. We had a broad discussion about the topic generally, so nope, I think that sounds good.
Great stuff. I think I was in group 2, and we said that the 2 issues were to examine the issue holistically at programme level and to try and find a way forward, and also to look at the leadership from senior management on this issue as well. And then group 3, Breed, who's in group 3?
Yeah, Mairead Clusky, Sandra, Stephanie McDermott, Samuel, and Hazel.
I think Mairead is going to speak. Are you there, Mairead?
Thanks, Stephanie. I didn't realise I was going to speak. I'm Padletting.
Poor Mairead is on her hospital. Well, she's on her bed with COVID. So well done, Mairead.
Yeah, so
Mairead.
I don't have her on, so just ignore that. We had a really good discussion. I guess one of the big things just to create spaces for people to take pride in their identity, and to recognise that isn't a one-way approach. That has to be, you know, nuanced and adapted and mindful of where people are at. So Stephanie gave a lovely example how she used her students' experience as a source of expertise in class, but also mindful. I think, Khadija, you had mentioned that we don't want to, like you were asked, what are you going to do to celebrate, you know, a certain event, so that we're not putting that responsibility on our minority students alone. And I guess just an overall commitment to reflective practice, Breach, that you talked about earlier, that we recognise that we're on a learning journey, that we don't have all the answers, that it's a changing, evolving kind of a space, but being committed to being anti-racist is committed to learn and from lots of different voices, and I guess talk around that brave space as well. Stephanie or Sandra, I don't know if you guys want to come in there on anything else.
No, I think you've summed it up really well, right? I think we're sometimes missing an opportunity. We have that experience in the room, and you know, over the years, I think students who have come in, you know, from migrant backgrounds or whatever, they tend to come in and just learn. They're not used as a resource, and I don't mean used as a resource, but it can be really powerful, and I've seen it happen where students have been together perhaps for 3 years and then come into the 4th year, and we have, you know, this opening up of dialogue, of experience within the room, whether that's been a woman that's parenting alone or whatever, but it's really, really powerful. And I'd love to incorporate more of that kind of learning from the room, if you like, because it does, I can get up and talk about racism and anti-racism, but you know, if someone gets up and says, well, actually someone shouted at me crossing the road the other day in Carlow, that has an intake of breath that, oh, I didn't think that happened, you know. So I think it would be great to use that resource and finding a way that that's really done sensitively, because what we don't want is having a kind of a token voice in the room. But my experience has been that students are more than happy to talk about their experiences, and we all value that.
Thanks, Stephanie. And then we'll finally get the feedback from breakout room number 4. Breed, will you tell us who's in that room?
Sorry, Leslie. I know Leslie just left. Bojana, Susan.
Okay, it was Kira and myself. I think Leslie actually possibly did more of the chatting, to be honest with you, so she's gone. So maybe we could just both speak for ourselves, really. I was just, I suppose, at the end, just saying that even in amongst our team for pastoral care and chaplaincy, that reflective practice would be really important in terms of really engaging with this and how we deliver our role across the campus, given that it has a kind of a multi-faith aspect as well to it. And we would be in, I suppose, spaces where we would engage with students from all across, and staff from all across different groups and sections. So yeah, we have a team meeting tomorrow, so I'm going to start the ball rolling tomorrow.
Great stuff, Susan. Okay, thanks very much for that feedback. I think there's been really rich discussion, and there's been a huge amount, well, for me personally, to take away from today, and I will be reviewing the recording as well to try and, you know, pull together all the different threads of discussion and dialogue that we've had today. We have 7 minutes left. I will just invite any final comments or questions or feedback on Breed's presentation. Khadija is still here, so on Khadija's earlier presentation as well, if anybody wants to come in with any questions. And just while you do that, we have been asked by the National Forum to get feedback on today's webinar, so I will put a link into the chat. So just while we wrap up, if you could complete the feedback, that would be very welcome. We have Faith, you want to come in with the question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, from your professional level, how this strategy can be channeled to benefit community development at large. What approach we can use starting from grassroots, and maybe to break it down like that. So how can that be? How can that happen? Thank you.
I'm not sure Khadija or Breed want to take that.
I might just come in there, Faith, and I think, you know, like a really good question. And I suppose in a way, I suppose that we educate the future community workers who are working from a community development approach. So I suppose until we are, you know, I suppose this is part and parcel of the work that we're doing now with the professional bodies as well. But and we need to engage with those grassroots organisations, so where our students grow on placement, so they have to be part of our conversation as well. But I suppose what we're trying to do is to, across all of the programme, you know, to start the conversation, to increase students' understanding, but also ours, the staff understanding of these issues, and that then we can work, I suppose, working from the community development approach, which is, you know, totally in keeping with around those values of, you know, anti-discrimination, equality, human rights. But that we are then, I suppose, preparing our students as graduates, not just in terms of their, you know, personal life, but also in terms of their professional life, that they will bring this back to the practice settings. But I think even we're also hoping that through our conversation with our community development partners, that we can learn from them as well. And we would engage, we presented at the World Community Development Conference just before the summer, so that I suppose we're learning from other educators, but also we need to learn from the practitioners on the ground, and that they can inform us as well. So this is very much a two-way approach as well. But part of it obviously as well then outside of community development is within our organisation, that we are taking action and challenging at an organisation or an institutional level, because that's our duty of care for students as well. I don't know if that...
Thank you very much. Very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so just before we run out of time, I don't know, Hazel has been working in the background on the graphic illustration. So Hazel, I don't know if we might pin you or put the spotlight on you to show the output of.
Thanks, Georgina. Yeah, no, I was actually just taking notes. It was also fast moving that I was taking notes, and now I've started drawing up the discussion. So I just have this first bit here from Kajida's presentation. So I'll be drawing this over the afternoon, and it should be ready for going up on Twitter by the end of the afternoon.
So this is a sneak preview of,
Yeah.
of what's to come. And on that note, I do have our Twitter handles in the chat if anybody wants to follow us, and I will share that later on via Twitter. So I don't know, any final comments, Breed?
I was going to say, could I use the last 2 minutes that's there? Mairead had a question earlier in the chat, and I know while Khadija gave some response to it, if Khadija had a minute to, it was about how to advise, how can we support our institutions to operationalise systems for complaints, reporting and support, because do you think that's a huge issue if people don't trust them, you know, or follow through?
Yeah, absolutely. But I did try and put a response in the chat there, but yeah, and that's a big question, isn't it? It's the gaining the trust. And I think the response I gave was really effective. There's a number of things that can be done. One is I've worked with some of our larger colleges and one of the universities to look at their dignity at work policy. And really, when you looked through it, actually, there was just a slight reference to different forms of discrimination. We need to be more specific. And I think that's really important. We need to make sure that when a BAME student or a BAME staff member turns to some of our policies, there is, just like our placement handbooks, somewhere for them to signpost them to, have you experienced, here's what you need to do. Maybe it's a key person, a senior leader that is named in there, so that there's that accountability, but also for our colleagues in professional services who are the ones front facing, who are where a student may go to raise a complaint or a concern. How well prepared are they? Do they have that nuanced understanding? So perhaps we need to provide that, you know, all important anti-racist training to our professional services staff at the chalk face, so that they have the language with which to support the student, but also have the kind of knowledge around the sort of psychological well-being of support that they're going to offer to that particular student or staff member, and that's really key. But I think for us, it's not those one-off anti-racist training sessions, but it's actually really that sustained, how are we going to build that in and continue to have those conversations, and then the senior leaders having an oversight of that happening.
Thanks a million, that's great.
So I think we're bang on 12 o'clock. Breeden, if you want to stop the recording now, but just again, let me thank especially Khadija for her time today. Her presentation was